Hello and welcome to the Black Book Interactive Project Scholar Program webinar series. My name is Sarah Arbuthnot-Lent and I'm the program coordinator for the BBIP Scholar Program. Thanks to everyone for connecting with us today. I know we're really excited for our speakers, so I will pass the baton to our BBIP director, Dr. Graham.
Thanks everybody. We know this is a really busy time. Many schools have actually started. The schools here have started, the public schools have started, students are coming to Tougaloo, so we know that many of you are in transition in that way. But this is a really important webinar for us, and some of us who have been at a conference have been hearing Kim's name spoken several times in connection with lots of things going on here. But Kim Gallen is a name you should know if you do not, and some of you do, who has one, inclusion efforts in the digital humanities, but also I think shifting the discussion about what it is. And that's one of the things that we're looking forward to hearing her talk about today. She's at Purdue University. She's involved in many things and has just come back from a time in Africa where she's been spending a lot of time each summer. I do have some official notes here on her in terms of her work has appeared many places. But you also know her from some of her websites. The other thing that's really important here is that Kim was the co-PI for, I think, the only advanced, subject in advanced digital humanities, is that it? What the title is? But she had a seminar, and so one of you had mentioned that, but she was a co-PI on that seminar, and in a sense, we're sort of following in her footsteps by expanding this dialogue with scholars and librarians and practitioners so that you can have greater access to what this is, but also can assist us at the Black Book Interactive Project to expand our database and think about new ways in which it can be used. So Kim gave us a lot of ideas about what we might do, how we might do this better. So Kim, I want to thank you publicly for that. But I did not participate in that seminar, but I know many people who did, and I heard great things about it. I don't want to take any more time because we want to give this time mostly over to Kim to talk. And Kim, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great, thanks. I really appreciate everyone joining today, particularly as Mariama says, it's a really busy time for people as we begin the start of the fall semester and classes, whether you're taking them or whether you're teaching them or, getting ready for the job market if you're in that, also that stage. But either way, I'm really pleased to be doing this today. As I was looking back over the previous webinars and thinking about where my webinar fits in today, I think it fits in really well, and I really appreciate the place I'm sort of positioned, because from what I understand, and I've looked at the previous webinars, there's been some really great conversations about specific projects and some of the technical aspects around data. I know that there was a webinar on social justice in DH, and my work really comes from both sort of a practical and sort of a theoretical point of view. I do Black DH in some of the projects that I'm still trying to work on and bring out. Just full disclosure, I'm traditionally trained as a historian. I'm in a very traditional history department, which very much means that in order to get tenure, I have to publish a book. And luckily that'll be coming out next spring. But it does mean that I've had to take some time off from really what I would say is probably one of my first loves, which is DH, and specifically Black DH. I came into DH like a lot of people of my sort of generation, even age, if you will, sort of by happenstance. I was a librarian for a few years and always liked building things and building guides and resources. And so I sort of fell into building the Black Press Research Collective, being the only Black faculty at a small liberal arts college. It was really about trying to create a community of people that were researching the Black press, and that sort of morphed into a digital project, and then luckily an NEH workshop, Digital Humanities Startup One. I can't believe I'm saying Startup One, that seems so long ago, but I guess in DH years, it is, quite frankly. And then that turned into other things that, again, that I'm still working on. I know that you read Making a Case for Black DH. What I'm going to present to you today is Making a Case for Black DH 2.0. It's actually a e-learning module I've been working on very slowly for people, particularly graduate students who are working in DH, who really want to take some of the things I talked about in in the first Making a Case for Black DH and really apply it. Some of the questions I've gotten in the last few years since I wrote that piece was, okay, this is great, but when you're working on a digital project, what are the specific things that I might do to actually create a Black DH project, or to fulfill some of the sort of guidelines, if you will, around Black DH? And so that's what I've been sort of struggling with and working through. As Mariama said, I do a lot of different things. So a couple years ago, I got a learning and design technology master's degree at Purdue. And so my work has also shifted into thinking about how DH specifically can sort of merge or put it into conversation with digital pedagogies and e-learning. And so that's what you're going to see today. So I'll probably spend about 45 minutes just walking you through what is essentially a e-learning module on Black DH. It's very incomplete, so I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Again, it's theoretical, but it is also trying to create some sort of specificity about Black DH projects. And then specifically, I end with looking at the Black literary tradition, or Black women's literary tradition particularly, and then trying to put that in conversation with Black literary digital projects. So if there are no preliminary or early questions, I'm going to share my screen, and I guess I'll just work through the module, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Okay? All right, so let me share. That's always like, oh goodness, is it going to actually work? But I think it will.
I think a few more people stepped in. I think I saw Kirsten. Didn't I see Kirsten? Somebody early.
Yeah. Well, welcome for the people that are just stepping in. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen that just say Making a Case for Black DH 2.0. Yep. Okay, great. What you see here is a e-learning platform called Rise. It's by Articulate Storyline. It's a web-based platform. It is subscription, or it is pay-based, so it's not something that's open source. So that is something that, as I think about building things in the e-learning world, is always going to be a rub and tension around e-learning platforms that tend to be behind paywalls. And so I'm also thinking about, when this is ready for prime time, how to make it open source. I would love to see it included in DH programs, particularly graduate programs. So again, I welcome the feedback and some of the ideas. It has no assessments yet or any sort of learning activities. It's all largely just sort of presentation now. So again, it is a work in progress, but I'd love just to get it started and show you what this is. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the thoughts for this. So again, in 2016, I wrote Making a Case for Black Digital Humanities. And what I was thinking at that time, that it was to disrupt and transform what I saw as largely the development of digital humanities, or what I would have said at the time was sort of the white digital humanities, with whiteness sort of standing as an unmarked category. And certainly there were growing voices, people like Moya Bailey. The History of Black Writing Project has always been a early and sort of a primary Black DH project, but what certainly was not being talked about in that way, and still remains on the margins of digital humanities in terms of thinking about its pioneering and innovative pieces to it, or innovative being an innovative project. But since that time, and I've been thinking about that piece a lot, I've become less convinced that disruption and transformation are the most effective strategies to talk about the relationships between the Blackness, the digital, and humanity. And that really is and was the goal of that piece, right? Less to think about, please let us into digital humanities as it relates to Black studies and Black digital projects, but more thinking about what Blackness, specifically Black studies, Africana studies, brings to the DH. So I think it's more important to think about, rather than disrupting or diversifying or transforming the digital humanities, redefining it, is to think about this notion of recovery and this unapologetic recovery of Blackness. I'm of the mind that people of color has a great value and a great way of thinking about the connections between people of color in different societies. But I'm less interested in thinking about sort of that big umbrella and really thinking about very narrowly about Blackness and Black DH, right? And so in this sense, this module, and I guess Black DH 0.20 is less concerned with calling on DH to be inclusive. And in this regard, Black DH in this sense is in concert with Black code scholars who, rather than are, asking for a seat at the table, is they're charting their own path, right? By thinking about themselves as a Black code. Or Black DH in this sense finds common ground with the digital Black Atlantic and its rejection of a Black monolith that only occurs within Western spaces. And I think my thinking about Black DH and where it might go also appreciates the efforts of, the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities initiative at University of Maryland, and the way that it centers Black scholars' efforts and offer them opportunities to develop project management and technical skills that are useful in the academic marketplace. So Black DH 2.0 certainly still has very much an investment in all of the other ways that Black DH or Black code or Black digital studies shows up in the academy. But nonetheless, I want to bring Black DH back to this ideal of Black humanity. And I think that's where Black digital studies is, right? And in that sense, it provides a sorely and theoretical, practical commitment to, as Howard Ransby noted, to thinking about the duality of the Black analog and digital selves. So I'm increasingly concerned that emerging scholars are being trained to develop digital projects in the Black experience without a critical understanding about the relationship between Blackness and the digital, so that there's an emphasis on training for technical skills, which I think are well needed and certainly funding should be put in there. But I'm also concerned that there's not a necessary time and space to look inward to recover and safeguard Black humanity in the digital, right? Because Black humanity or Black DH does, I would argue, what Blackness has always done. It really attenuates a dehumanizing potential of the digital. And I'm calling the digital, again, sort of whiteness in this sense. The digital is, when we talk about the digital, it is certainly a very diverse landscape, but we often talk about the digital without, modifier of whiteness. And a lot of the digital, in terms of the resources, the people who are controlling digital infrastructure are certainly white. I often say to some of my colleagues, I think consternation, that it's great to talk about Black Twitter, but Black Twitter is not Black. I mean, certainly it's Black in the way that Black people use it. It's created lots of consciousness and raised consciousness about a wide range of conditions of Black people, but Black people do not own Twitter. They make a very little percentage of the people who work there. And I come from the tradition of studying the Black press, where the Black press was largely of the early 20th century, independent and wholly owned by Black people. And there's power in that. And this is not to marginalize or to minimize all the white people and other people of color who are very much in the struggle for all humanity and specifically Black humanity. But when Black people continue to be marginalized in a wide variety of different sort of spaces in the digital, I think there is power in Black people owning the mode and the means and the sort of production of their digital work. If Twitter wants to end Black people's relationship with the social media, they could do that as immediately, and many Black people would have no recourse. So I just want to, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it is certainly related. So Black DH 2.0 reimagines the digital from a Black vantage point. Again, I want to center Blackness. And so for this reason, I think about Black as being placed in front of the digital as less an intervention and actually for making the digital more humane. I taught a course last semester on digital slavery studies, which is, really, really blossomed. And there's some great resources on the transatlantic slave trade. I'm specifically talking about the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, specifically in North America. Great projects, great resources, but so many of those projects are, while very technologically sophisticated, have sort of forgotten the people who were at the center of the system of slavery, right? And so Black DH reminds us that it is the humanity of Black people that it always should be at the center when we're doing digital scholarship. Yes, you can do digital innovative work. Yes, you can text mine and do work with data. That's all important sort of things, but Black people in a Black DH project should be at the center of that. And I guess I'm sort of like the boys in the sense that I'm thinking about that Black DH should be propaganda. It should be about creating spaces, whether it's in the academy or outside the academy, for the recovery of Black people's lives historically and contemporarily. So Blackness pulls humanity to the forefront of the digital humanities. So thinking about Black DH, I thought it was important to think about defining some key concepts in Black DH. So in that piece, I say that, I don't want to, and I actually make this quote about discussing exact definitions of who is in and who is out in Black digital humanities. And, I'm being very, very sort of blunt and honest here. That was a political move. I knew the audience that I was writing for, that audience in debates in digital humanities, largely going to be majority of white scholars and white students. And I was really concerned that I was going to alienate some of my audience by marking off some very specific ways that Black DH is very Black, right? So I avoided precise definitions of what constituted as Black digital humanities. And I argued that Black DH reflects less an actual thing and more of a constructed space to consider the intersections between the digital and Blackness. And I also said that too, because I didn't want to be pinned down, right? Because once you start pinning down, then you have people are like, well, is this Black DH or this is Black DH? So I did want some flexibility for people to work within a space, right? And certainly not be so prescriptive. But then it sort of loses, some of the specificity that I hope that Black DH would sort of materialize into, right? So while I still maintain that definition, I do think that there's a time, and I want to use this module to create more of a definition around the concept of Black DH. I'm seeing a chat. Is anyone trying to send me a message? No, okay.
Oh, no, that's just me. Please ignore that. I just sent a message to Sarah. Just
okay, good.
That.
So,
hey, everyone.
So what I thought, Miriam Posner uses the concept of a black box and how did I make that piece, right? And so I've chosen to represent key concepts in Black DH in a black box in an effort to help students reverse engineer what the Black digital humanities means. And a black box is very symbolic, right? But I don't want it to be an exclusive container or a restrictive boundary, meaning that anything that doesn't occur in this box means that it's not Black DH. I mean, really, literally, the black box is just a way to capture some of these things. And like Posner, I want students to recognize patterns in different digital projects, that these concepts should assist students and scholars, and quite frankly, everyone that's on this webinar, if you are invested in identifying your work as Black DH, to help you, build some patterns and reoccurring themes that are across different Black digital humanities projects. So if you click on each marker, there's just some language here to help people think about what Black DH is, right? So already I talked about it as being a constructed space to consider the intersections between the digital and Blackness. But it also means that Blackness is a meta language in the digital terrain. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't intersectional sort of ways to think about Blackness. Certainly, I'm a Black feminist, and so I would be remiss in arguing that gender and sexuality, class, right, age, region, continent or transnational Blackness doesn't come into the foray. But I do think about Higginbotham's piece about, race as a meta language, and I do think about Blackness as a meta language, that there is a way that Blackness operates as a meta language that inscribes the way that people think about the digital and how the digital comes to bear on Black people's lives. Black DH should recover Black humanity, again, historically, contemporarily, and that recovery shows up in different sort of ways, but that recovery essentially is about making sure that students, scholars, audiences understand the ways that Black people's humanity has been and continues to be marginalized and oppressed, and using the digital to make sure that that Blackness or that humanity is highlighted, emphasized. Also, it includes a digital as a like an episteme of humanity that is less tool-oriented and more invested in interrogating the digital as a progenitor of new and different forms of racialization. And that really, racialization can show up very positively and proactively. Again, I think social media, specifically Twitter, has been a wonderful place to show how racialization can create agency and create social movements. But certainly that racialization is also often countered by the way that racialization can be a dehumanizing experience, and the digital and Black DH projects makes that very clear. I also think that Black DH uses digital as a space to to sort of create this way of breaking down the humanities or race-inducing processes. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the humanities should be at the center for thinking about how race gets constructed, again, in a political, positive way, but also in ways that are dehumanizing. But again, so when I'm thinking about Blackness as emphasizing humanity, I'm also thinking about Blackness as emphasizing the humanities, if that makes sense. So there's the sort of singular humanity of Black people, but there's also, again, the humanities as a process and as a discipline for recovering Black humanity. Couple more. I think Black DH also discloses how methodological approaches for studying and thinking about the category of Blackness may come to bear on and transform digital processes and tools used to study a humanity. I think there's ways that we can look at specific digital tools and measure them using sort of the metric of what this will do in terms of thinking about Blackness as a way to assess the value of a particular tool for a project, or even trying to break a digital tool in order to make it more conducive to developing the sort of things that you want it to develop. I'm working with a digital tool right now that is where I'm using it for something that it was not meant to use, with looking at the way that Blackness was visualized on early 20th century magazines, and using it to develop the some arguments about the relationship between gender and skin color. That digital tool was not used or meant for that, but I'm sort of breaking the tool and creating a way to actually use it to actually think more seriously about the visualization of Black people, specifically Black women's skin color, and the way that it's used to think about their humanity. Finally, last two, Black DH foregrounds race and racism and corresponding resistance as powerful cultural and social forces that are deeply entrenched and wielded by the digital. And then finally, Black DH probes and distorts Western ontological conceptions of humanity. I get tripped up on some of those words sometimes. So moving forward, I also wanted to think about Black digital humanities and the genealogy and the key events and publications in order to think about Black DH and to think about it as a thing. Black DH should be committed to establishing a legacy of Black technophilia, right, that predates the digital turn in the humanities. I still think, and Anna Everett has talked about this, that there's this ideal that Black people are either technophobes or early consumers of digital technologies, right? That they don't actually produce digital stuff, but they just are great consumers of it. And I think that sometimes the way that Twitter has, and Black people's use of Twitter has actually veered more into consumption as opposed to actually using the digital technology or producing things with the digital technology. So I think it's important to establish in Black DH a rich history of Black digital, again, technophilia or Black people's use of digital technology, and to make it as sort of the innovation of DH, right? To create sort of Black DH as the sort of primary ground on which DH rests. And by creating a genealogy, and this is far from finished, but it's just a way to create history, right? I'm a historian, and it's a way to create a narrative about Black DH that predates, you know, making a case for Black DH, right? That piece stands on the shoulders of the history of the Black Writing Project. And it stands on, let me just move through this. It stands on pieces like The Unbearable Whiteness of Being, like African-American Critical Theory and Cyberculture. You can see these dates going all the way back to 1983 and then 96. And I'm certainly sure that I'm missing things in between here. And so if you can help me make this a more complete timeline, that would be terrific. You know, the African-American women's writers of the 19th century, the digital Schomburg, is 20 years old this year, right? Has there been anything on Black Twitter or Twitter or anything celebrating this really innovative project, looking at African-American women's writers of the 19th century? Maybe, I might have missed it, but it needs to be recognized as being a very early and innovative digital project. And again, images of 19th century African-Americans at the digital Schomburg, very foundational pieces. And then Afro Geeks, from Technophobia to Technophilia, that conference. Digital diasporas, and again, these are just select things that I've mentioned here, right? This may be, and I think this was, I think if I'm not mistaken, this was funded by the NEH, or maybe not. Maybe Jennifer can speak to that. But certainly an early digital Black DH conference, right, at the University of Maryland in May 2008. And then we had eBlack Studies of Abdul Akilimat, which was grounding and pioneering in its connection between Black studies and the digital, or, you know, or E, right? And what that did for, you know, Black DHs in terms of helping to bring that Black DH into being. FIRE, the Multimedia Journal of Black Studies, right, which is being reinvented by Brian Carter and his editorship. Brian Carter at the University of Arizona and Black DH there. And then that episode of Left of Black with Howard Ramsey and Jessica Marie Johnson, early piece in 2012 talking about the state of Black studies and the digital humanities again. And there's Howard Ramsey also in that as well. Then we see Black Thought 2.0, New Media, the Future of Black Studies, a conference at Duke, right? Again, talking about new media and digital humanities and the future of Black studies. African Diaspora 2.0, Oral Sources and Digital Humanities at York University. Marissa Parham's piece at Myth, Without Innovation, African American Life Growth in the Internet of Things. Synergies are intentionally, I think, digitally Black. No, that was later on. The Synergies grant at Myth. And all the wonderful things that they do there as also being part of this legacy and this history. Hashtag Envisioning Black Spaces with Alicia Garza. Rutgers Digital Blackness Conference in 2016. The institute I ran with Angel Nieves in 2016. And then the conference at Purdue, Intentionally Digital, Intentionally Black at Maryland in 2018, which I missed, but I heard it was a wonderful conference. And so on, right? And more pieces to come. Again, this is incomplete. But the point being that we need to start telling stories and making the history of Black DH known and visible in order to create the sort of pipeline for junior scholars and undergraduates and even high school students, right? I worked with a high school student this year on a Latinx project where she was mapping murals in Chicago using GIS ARC story mapping, right? Never had heard of digital humanities before, but through my work with her is now going to do a Latinx project for her senior thesis and certainly thinking about applying to graduate school now, thinking about digital humanities, right? So we need to start, creating these narratives and creating these stories for our junior scholars and potential junior scholars in order to create a long-lasting sort of relationship between or create, the Black DH and to make sure that it continues into the future. Okay, so let's look at Black digital humanities theory, pedagogy, and practice. So like if you wanted to teach Black digital humanities, what would that mean, right? So I think about Black digital humanities in the color line, right? So Du Bois's discussion of the color line in the context of the digital asks us to seriously consider the significance of Black humanity in the 21st century that has evolved along the color line and one that is boldly Black and digital, right? I think it was so interesting, during the Obama era to hear people talking about post-Blackness, which you definitely do not hear that anymore. And it was an interesting conversation to think about this notion of post-Blackness. But I think what's happened in the last few years is that there has been a recovery of Blackness and this being bold and sort of Black and digital, right, at the same time. In a way that I think Black DH can really capitalize on, particularly in the classroom. So what does Blackness mean when it's constructed and shaped within the spaces between the analog and the digital? How can we help students understand that relationship? Again, these are just preliminary thoughts, but we can start thinking about data, right? And data, again, as Black data. So I always make the joke is that I like to put Black in front of everything. So in order to, because I think that there's significance in that, right? Not that everything has to sort of be modified by Blackness, but I do think that when we are doing work with data, specifically on Black people's lives, there is a way that we need to think about Blackness and race and foreground race as a way of thinking about what data means, right? And so, this is a small little screenshot of the Manifest of Slaves, basically data. And so we have to think about data and talk about what data means and what guidelines or what ways are we thinking about teaching students how to work with data that is on Black people's lives? How do we handle and work with data about Black people's lives, particularly when we were thinking about preserving and recovering humanity, right? And what responsibilities do data scientists and visualization experts have to do no harm to Black bodies and lives gone and in many cases forgotten, right? So, a lot of us will work with visualization experts or data scientists. How can we work with them to help them understand that, data isn't just data, that data is very politicized, that data in many ways has been used to pathologize Black people, even as data can be used to recover Black people's humanity. But we need to have those conversations first with our students to help them understand that, but then certainly in our own work as we deal in teams of digital humanities teams where many of our work with data will be through our relationship with a data visualization expert or a data scientist. So how does a Black image function as data? And what I have here is an image of the slave. It's called Gordon with a lot of the welts on his back. I won't show it here, but it's a very famous image, and you see the scarring of probably many whippings, right? And I like to show that sometimes to help students, and I showed it in my digital slavery studies course, where I asked students to think about what it would mean to visualize each of those scars, right? To think about that person's humanity, that Black man's humanity, and think about that as data points, right? It's a little abstract, it may be even a little out there, but what I wanted them to understand is to think about how we can think about the pieces, like even Black people's body as sort of embodying or representing sort of data on their lives, right? Or data on how they've been treated. And what might informed consent mean in the context of Black data sets or Black people's lives? Who should own photos of slaves? The descendants, not Harvard, a lawsuit says, and so you may have been acquainted with that story about the descendants of enslaved people who photos I think are owned by Harvard, and the debate about who owns that material. How do differentials in power and the politics of Blackness complicate consent, either consent of the descendants of people or consent of people in the here and now, again, about how their data is used or how data is collected. What review processes are necessary in order to analyze the data methods and approaches that are used to visualize Black lives past and present. What visualization strategies might mitigate the dehumanizing work of data science and visualization of Black life? And then again, what responsibility do data scientists and visualization experts have to recovering Black humanity? If they're working with data on Black people's life, particularly in digital humanities projects, what is the responsibility of centering Black humanity in those projects? Again, these are questions without any sort of real clear answer, but certainly questions that need to be asked and discussed in classrooms when we're talking about digital humanities, specifically Black digital humanities. So the Black digital humanities equals humanistic pedagogy, right? Again, this is incomplete. I'm starting to think about what that means. So Black DH calls on educators to be more humanistic in their pedagogy, challenging to use technological processes and digital tools to teach, not simply from a racialized or a cultural perspective, but a Black one. And I would argue that teaching from a Black perspective is a very valuable vantage point, right? Not necessarily in the lived experience as I, Kim Gowland, Black woman who's going to teach you about my experience, but certainly about the ways that Black people have struggled against insurmountable odds to create lives for themselves, to think critically about the construction of race, to think critically about politics, to think critically about the Black human body, right? That is a very valuable place to teach from, right? And so to think about Blackness as an epistemological and ontological standpoint that is predicated on the recovery of humanity and the human condition. So what I'm arguing for is that in Black DH, it helps us see how teaching from a Black standpoint creates and illuminates a larger sort of set of factors in general for everyone, not just for the Black people that might be in the class or teaching about Black people's lives, but teaching very much about the human condition. And I think that Black DH offers us a way to really think about doing that. So Black digital humanities in practice, I want to start a Black DH program or certificate, which I would love at some point at my university or, in my graduate program. Well, some of the things that you might want to think about is that it should be centered in Africana, Black studies, epistemology, and praxis, right? That it should not certainly exclusively going to have Black DH educators, designers, and developers, but certainly must have them, right? Not exclusively, but it must have them. It must center their work. That it adopts social media as a subject and a platform for research, learning, and instruction. I think more and more people are invested in thinking about the ways that social media and digital humanities sort of merge and overlap with each other. At some point, I heard people sort of marginalizing people who are working in social media. I still think there are some of those sort of conversations, I think less so, but I think certainly social media should be centered in a Black DH project. There should be Black DH centers with Africana Black Studies departments and programs. I think we're starting to see that. I think, University of Michigan is doing that sort of work. I think other university Black studies programs are also doing more work with Black digital studies, Black code, Black, digital Atlantic studies. And so I think that's also been very useful and helpful. And then Black DH fellowships and funding. It would be great to see, places like Harvard and Yale, people with money, other places, HBCUs, designate funding specifically for people who want to work in Black DH, right? So, this project specifically is a great example of funding for people who are particularly interested in working in Black digital literary studies. The NEH Advanced Topics seminar on Black Spatial Humanities was another funding opportunity to just work within this space that looks at the Black studies and the relationship between the digital humanities. And then finally, if any, pedagogy, any teaching, any practice certainly must have reading and digital projects from which it operates, right? Again, these are select readings and digital projects that are important in Black DH. It's incomplete. I'm still working on this, but there certainly should be bibliographies on Black DH now that are in circulation. There will come a time, and there may have been already, where people will have Black DH as a field in their particular program, and we need to have readings and be able to go to graduate programs already who may not understand Black DH and say, there's a set of readings, there's work that's being done in this area. This student certainly can have a field in this area because of the growing work or the existing work that is there. But we need to document that, and we need to have bibliographies and reading lists at hand for graduate students so that they can go to their advisors or go to their program chairs or heads and make a case for that. Okay, finally, I'm going to just turn to Black DH recovery and Black women's literary tradition. So how could I not use Toni Morrison, right? Who unfortunately passed after a very rich literary life. It would almost seem to be wrong, if I'm talking about Black DH recovering Black women's literary tradition, to not talk about Toni Morrison. And in fact, she has become the centerpiece of this. And this piece, I don't think I'm going to include in the overall module. It was certainly an add-on for the presentation today. But I think she gives us a lot to think about when we think about how to think about ways to structure Black DH projects, specifically Black literary projects. And so I have three very, very brief clips from different interviews, two from PBS NewsHour, and then one from an interview on jazz that she did. I have them queued up to the right minutes or where they should be. So I'll play them for a minute or two, and then I'll talk about how I see them working in relationship with Black DH.
You said many years ago, and back in the 70s, that you were an editor at that time at Random House, and you were saying that you wanted to participate in developing a canon of Black work beyond Black self-flagellation, the kind of entertainment that you felt was being encouraged among Black writers by white editors or the white society. Did you succeed in particular, and has the publishing world succeeded in general in having a better balance of work. A little, there's still resistance because the fix on who that reader is hasn't changed a great deal. The reader is somebody between 40 and 60 who's white and lives, in a suburb near a big city. There's sort of classic profiles of who buys books. But something happened in the meantime, and a huge readership emerged, Black and white and female, which made a difference in what was published. When I mentioned the self-flagellation, I was particularly aware of some titles in particular, but more importantly, the eagerness with which publishers and people in the book industry were interested in books by Black people that said, tell me how angry you are. Let me see your anger. Tell us how terrible it has been for you. And so there was a sly encouragement to sort of expose the horrors of being the victim, which some people played into. But it was like feeding the vampire with one's own blood. Instead of describing, a complicated, extraordinary survival life, which doesn't mean you wipe the slate clean and all the Black people are heroic, and there was a mood of that. But you have what I regard as some of the most complicated, interesting, mysterious people in the world, a whole group of them. And they need to be revealed for what that life is, not simply to reveal and educate or even play into the hands of the yearning, what used to be a yearning for guilt, expressions of guilt by white people. And that's what I meant by that sort of large book. And I wanted that to change. And many Black women writers have succeeded along those lines.
I'll stop there. I had this a little bit out of order, so I apologize for that. So what I think Toni Morrison was really saying there is that Black literary text, and then I'm going to include Black DH, should be about the beautiful complexity of Blackness, right? So Black DH Recovering the Digital speaks to the way that the digitization of African-American literary text should mystify and make complex the condition and history of African Americans or Black people rather than clarifying it for audiences. What do I mean by that? Certainly there's value in clarifying that experience, but in clarifying or reducing Black people down to this idea of simply oppressed or victims rejects the rich complexity and the rich diversity of Black people's lives. And I think Black DH, particularly Black DH that's working with literary text, specifically literary text, has the ability to create complexity, beautiful complexity that doesn't obscure, but complexity that enriches Black humanity and the Black experience. And I think that's what Toni Morrison teaches us. She teaches us that Black work doesn't have to clarify, it doesn't have to speak to this notion of distilling Blackness down to one set of experiences, right? That it can be a wide, rich myriad of experiences. Play the next clip. And again, I apologize, I had this a little bit out of order, so I'll have to go back and fix that.
Previous accounts of slavery being simplistic and not probing the interior being of the characters. How difficult was it for you to probe the interior being of characters, albeit Black, still from a long, long time ago?
Exactly.
Well, my disappointment in some of the accounts was based on the fact that this is so large, you see. And then the big problem is that slavery is so intricate, so immense, and so long, and so unprecedented that you can let slavery be the story, the plot, and we know what that story is, and it is predictable. And then you do the worst thing, which is the center of it becomes the institution and not the people. So if you focus on the characters and their interior life, it's like putting the authority back into the hands of the slave rather than the slaveholder. What is the rationale for the ghost? First of all, I really want...
So I'll stop it there. So here, I think, and this Black Lives Matter is obviously a social movement, and I was debating on whether to, use that as a quote, but it fits that Black DH recovery and Black DH literary text challenges the focus on computation in DH and its emphasis on text rather than the authors and the text themselves and the people the text are talking about. So what I think is beautiful and what Toni Morrison is saying is that, yes, we can talk about the institution of slavery, and we certainly should, but we can't lose sight of the people who were harmed by that institution, and they should be the center of that. Again, going back to my digital slavery studies course, it was quite easy for my students to talk about slavery, the institution, but I constantly had to urge them to think about Black humanity and Black people, how digital slavery studies, which largely many of the projects are about the institution. There are certainly some that attempt to center the people, but many of them don't. I have to constantly urge them to think about how the digital can come to bear on talking about Black lives, Black humanity, Black people who were harmed by this system of slavery. And then the last clip.
Are you writing for now an audience? I mean, I read some story about a young man, a young African-American student who stands up at Princeton or somewhere at a lecture, and he says, "Who's your audience?" And you say, "Who are my audience? I'm principally writing for you." Tell me who you're writing for. What did you mean to that young man?
Well, I reduced it to a cliche almost, which is to say, I want to write for people like me, which is to say, Black people,
Right.
curious people, demanding people, people who can't be faked, people who don't need to be patronized, people who have very, very high criteria. That seemed to be the way Black people always were. I mean, you can't fake them out in music. I mean, if you can't do it that way, you just can't be there. You can't fake them out in basketball. They always are reinventing the level of achievement, raising it, raising it, raising it. But somehow, so much of the literature, or at least the work about the literature, was depressing it, and writing sort of simple-minded stories, the popular literature. And I wanted to have my work to be as complex, as intricate, as supple as the music was, or anything else that Black people did in a group. So that when I say I'm writing for you, young Black man, or me, I am not marginalizing him. I am not making him peripheral. I'm saying this is very important, and I know your demands are high.
Are you?
So here, I think what Toni Morrison is asking us to think about is centering Blackness, right? And to ask us to critically think about who we are developing these projects for. Are they projects that will get you a job, maybe, or promote it, maybe? Are they projects to show off particular technical skills and to wow people with, innovative digital tools? In Black DH, I would urge people to think about how the audience does matter, right? And I'm not arguing, and I really don't think that, there's been debates in the last couple of days about who Toni Morrison was writing for. I'm not sure that's actually productive or helpful, even though I do understand the concern behind making sure that people understand that she was writing particularly for Black people. In the same vein, I certainly would say that, Black DH projects are not just for Black people, but I would say that Blackness should be centered. So it's not just about lost text or visualizing Black literature. Rather, Black DH projects should fundamentally decenter whiteness and unapologetically call for substantive changes to how Black people are understood and treated in society. So I think with Toni Morrison, or how I read her thoughts about, writing and that young Black man that she was writing for, is to say that he matters as an audience, that she sees him when she's developing her work. And I would argue that in Black DH projects, to also see Black people as primary recipients and audiences, both within the academy and outside the academy for the work, and that should shape what that work looks like and what that work does. finally, I'll just wrap up with saying that when I think about Black digital literary projects that do the work of Black DH, that centers Blackness, that calls on digital tools and technologies to be more humane, that recovers Black humanity, even as it does some really interesting work with data and mapping, but foregrounds Black voices, right? I think of Kenton Ramsby's work, and he may have showed this in his webinar, so I apologize if I'm showing this again, but I do really want to call it out as an innovative project, as an innovative literary project, to give you an example, a concrete example of what a Black DH literary project looks like. So I certainly won't take you through the whole project because I don't have time to do that right now. He created it with Peace Awesome Williamson, and he used Scalar to create the project. But I will say that it is an innovative project that looks at Lost in the City, Edward P. Jones' literary short fiction, and looks at the way he talks about Black lives and how he situates Black lives spatially in Washington, D.C. And even something as simple as starting off with the author himself, hearing the voice of Edward P. Jones and what he thinks about his work, foregrounding his experiences, his literary voice, right, is a way to think about how to develop a Black DH project, to think about the students and the people that, and the producers. In this case, he's interviewed the video producer for the Scalar project, and how she describes the literary characteristics and thematic shifts of Black writers to offer a larger context. And here, if you go into the content, table of contents, you see wonderful ways that he starts to map out these specific places in DC, and showing how Edward P. Jones brings Black people's lives together in certain spaces. So I would urge you to, if you haven't already, which you may have, take a look at this project. But again, just wanting to show you something concrete that I think functions very, very beautifully as a Black DH project. So I'll stop there, and I hope that I've given you something to think about, and that you have some questions that I can hopefully answer, and that we can have a productive conversation for the last part of the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Kim. Does anybody have questions? Please just jump right in.
So first, thank you for your presentation. I thought it was wonderful. I thank you.
Oh, Jacinta, I'm sorry, I'm looking for who's, so I see you.
Okay, yeah, hi, Jacinta again. My question is specifically about funding for projects that are in progression, and being able to navigate having the rights and permissions and how to get those sorts of things, and who to talk to when it becomes a conversation of how to turn a DH project public. Okay.
Can you, so what types of things are we talking about? Are we talking about things that are copyrighted by?
Oh, well, I'm not even, so I'll just go ahead and talk about my project. I have digitized the entire Essence bestsellers list for fiction. And I am now in a place where I am building a database that I want to have available online for other scholars and researchers or whoever wants access to it. But the list is owned by Essence, but half of it is owned by Essence and half of it is owned somewhere else. Yeah. The person who was the longtime editor who really shepherded the list through was ousted about 2 years ago from Essence. So I don't even know where to begin for as how to navigate, making sure that this project remains my project, but also making sure that I'm receiving the proper permissions and giving proper citations for where it came from.
It is such a sort of consistent problem and issue that people face in digital studies and digital humanities. I don't have an easy answer for you, quite frankly, because it is messy, and I face that in my own work, particularly trying to track down, authors of pieces in Black newspapers and trying to figure out where the lines of ownership begins and ends. I mean, if half of the list is owned by Essence, I certainly would start there. I don't know if you've had a conversation with them yet, but I certainly would start there.
Because I didn't want it to go, I didn't know where to begin.
Yeah, so you haven't had a conversation with them yet? Yeah, I would certainly start there. And you know, you might be surprised. I was working with the Chicago Defender 2 weeks ago, getting permission. You know, they stopped their print edition, so I was like, oh gosh, this is going to be horrible trying to get in touch with people to get permission to republish some cartoons from the paper. And I was given permission and didn't have to pay for anything. I do think that these types of projects, particularly Black projects with Black publications, sometimes there can be a way that people want to work with you in order to see the project come to fruition. So I would certainly start with Essence and then try to track down the owners of the second half of it. But you certainly are moving in the right direction because you want to get permission in order to make sure the proper people are credited, but also to make sure your project is a legitimate project. So,
Thank you.
I was interested in your own newspaper, the work you're doing with Black newspapers,
yeah.
and I wanted to ask you more about the kinds of newspapers you're seeking, how you see scholars interacting with this, because I think that what you were saying earlier about us owning and controlling the platforms is important. So I wanted to ask you more about how these newspapers will be available to scholars and how you see scholars interacting with them, and what kinds of newspapers you'll be incorporating. More about that.
Yeah, so right now the Black Press Research Collective has been on a little bit of a hiatus, but I specifically named it Black Press Research Collective because it's always been very much my goal to make it much more diasporic as opposed to North American newspapers, which tend to be the most discussed North American Black newspapers, specifically United States newspapers, tend to be the more discussed papers. And so Black was always sort of an umbrella term that would include even African newspapers or continental newspapers. And I know that would bring up a whole debate about what Blackness is, which I'm prepared and always happy to have that discussion because I think it can be very generative. Right now, it is certainly focused on Black North American United States newspapers. And what the goal is in that project, as I pick it up now, is to, particularly with the Defender ending its print edition, is to make sure people, first and foremost, understand the legacy of the Black newspaper, but secondarily, is to help people understand what they can do with existing digitized text, right? So a lot of these Black newspapers, certainly not all of them, are digitized through, paywall subscriptions in many cases, but sometimes not with the Library of Congress. Is I'm interested in what are the next steps now that these things have been digitized. What can we do with these, right? I'm really, really interested in how we can use visualization technologies to look at images in Black newspapers and to visualize those images, to create deeper meanings about them, and to also think about Black newspapers as a spatial, as a space within itself, right? To think about Black spatial humanities as moving from geospatial places, but literally the space of a newspaper page, and how that becomes a way to think about Black space and Blackness and Black humanity, literally in terms of how papers are situating and publishing things next to each other, and what narratives that tell us, and how we can use digital technology to manipulate that and create new narratives about a Black press.
I want to say thank you. Your work is really important, especially with the loss of Ebony's archive. So thank you for doing that.
Sure.
This is Sarita.
Hi, Sarita.
Hi. So my question is, I was troubled by the fact that you were saying that you had to kind of like push pause on your digital work so that you can produce something more traditional. Yeah. And so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about this? Because as I'm supposed to be developing digital projects here, I'm tenured and been done with all of that, but I don't know if this is a good thing for me to encourage my colleagues if we're still at a place where we're not really valuing these digital projects. And so I just was wondering, what your thoughts are about, like, how far are we until we get to some kind of parity or equity for digital projects?
I really think, I hate to make a general statement. So I'm in a very, very traditional history department. And I knew that going into it. I was trained as a historian, so I certainly know, and I love teaching history. It's interesting, you know, you can't go back in time, and maybe that's a good thing in many ways, but I wonder now if I could go back in time, or if I was a new scholar coming out, a younger scholar coming out, would I situate myself more as a Black DH or digital humanities? And I would have to say yes. You know, your scholarship takes you in lots of different places, and you know, the academy will evolve. Hopefully, if we live long enough, as we are within it, we'll all pick different paths. But I had picked the path of being a historian, and what that meant is publishing a book. And my history department in Purdue has been wonderful in supporting my digital work, always let me know that while they value that work would not get me tenure. And so in writing a book, I certainly just could not afford and didn't have the luxury to really, really work on digital projects as I really wanted to. I would hesitate to discourage people, particularly younger scholars, because I do think more and more departments are not just open, are very, very interested in people doing digital work. I would just say know your department, know your program, know what is going to get you promoted or what the metrics are going to be. And if the metrics are less digital, there are ways to bring your digital into more sort of traditional scholarship, or to, you know, create spaces to either write or to produce things, but it should, you know, probably will have to compete with the other work. But I certainly would not tell people or discourage people from entering into the digital humanities in any shape, form, or fashion. I think that the digital humanities has helped me become a better scholar in sort of the more traditional field of history, as opposed to it taking away. And so I think, you know, helping people understand that even if you can't develop a full-blown digital project or focus 100% of your time on it, that working in the digital humanities will enrich your work in all aspects. And they certainly should try to, you know, play with tools and technologies and think about the theoretical paradigms in digital humanities.
Right, and just one last follow-up with that. So do you have ways to peer review your digital projects?
Yeah, the American Historical Association has been really wonderful. MLA also has some stuff. I think there's some other associations. They have guidelines, which have been really helpful for my department as they measure my work. So I'm going up for tenure now, and they are using AHA to look at my writing, as well as some of the digital work I did, the seminar, the NEH seminar, that's being looked at really, really closely and being heavily considered. And also being, you know, not to get personal, but I have enough publications, but also to see that work as just as valuable as a publication, right? And that it took time and energy and effort, and that it was a rich scholarly contribution and should be valued as such. And so I, you know, again, while I needed to publish a book to get tenure, my work in the digital humanities and digital history is certainly being recognized in that sense.
Other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I would like to thank you for a very rich presentation. And I want to focus on one thing.
Sure.
When you pay tribute to Toni Morrison, I would suggest that people involved in this project would return to playing in the dark and put that in the context of digital humanities, Black digital humanities or whatever. What was Morrison doing in that book that is parallel to what we must do in terms of understanding where problems are located? And indeed, I would suggest, when we talk about social media, we realize that the problems of Blackness and whiteness and any other coloredness are pathological in terms of what our government does. And that a lot of government policy will have to be examined when we talk about how images are produced, or how policies, for example, encourage people in the publishing world, outside the publishing world, certainly in medicine and other services, to either value or devalue somebody's humanity.
Right.
And I'm not going to say whose humanity, but I'm noticing more and more that the most pathological people in this United States of ours are not Black people.
I think there's a good case to be made for that. So, and just to pick up on, and thank you for that reference. I certainly, and adding Toni Morrison was certainly not an afterthought, but became more important as people are, you know, revisiting her work and thinking about her legacy. And it made me think about really what she has to say. So I certainly will go back to Playing in the Dark, and I do appreciate that reference. But you know, the questions or the thoughts that you had is really thinking of, is really where I would like people working in Black DH to sort of be. Certainly not to, you know, and I appreciate you not labeling one group or another necessarily, but to think about the ways and the function of Blackness and Black people's lives and where they are in relationship to how people are treated and how people are understood as human. And I really, really, really believe that that is the value of Black studies, Africana studies at the very core of that. And then that is the relationship between Blackness studies and DH, is to think about the human condition and what does it mean to be human in a digital enriched world and all its complexity and all of its challenges and all of the negative things that comes with, you know, a world that is circumscribed by the digital. That is what I think Black DH can offer. And so I appreciate your comments, Jerry.
Thank you.
Kim, I lost connection there for a good little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, I lost connection there for a little bit, and so it started when you were doing the Morrison video. So I was gone for a good bit. I missed some of those good questions. I'm so sorry, Saritha, Jerry, but I did want, and maybe somebody said this, but no, we have not seen Kenton's work, and he actually will be presenting it in our IDRH seminar in this fall. That's right, so we haven't seen it. And the young woman you showed there, Jade, is joining our team in the fall as well. In about a week, I guess, she'll be joining our HBW team, and will be specifically working on BPIP since Arnav is moving out and Jade is phasing in because he is finishing his doctorate. But you have given us so much to think about, and it just, I mean, it's resonating with me in all kinds of ways. And as Jennifer said earlier, we did this pre-conference workshop, which was inspired by an NEH seminar, sort of a crash course, and Jennifer, correct me if I have this wrong, that NEH sponsored, that a number of people participated in. And so they wanted to bring that to this museum's conference. And so they did it in a pre-conference workshop. So some of those questions were, came up, Yeah. And I do think, I mean, and speaking for myself, I'm probably still at the disruptive side of yours. I said so much in my workshop. I'm still at that notion that we still have to disrupt. That's probably because I'm old school, child of the 60s, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I do think that, I think it's good to remember that is important. But I totally agree with the restoration part, the recovery part, because, HBW was always a recovery project, always will be a recovery project.
Right.
We have to go to the next stage. So other people, please chime in. Like I said, I was struggling. I had to go downstairs to the hotel lobby to get back on the internet. I mean, I was screaming and yelling like a crazy woman, but they gave me some attention, and so I hope I hold out until the session is over. Any other questions?
We have a question from Taisha in the group chat, Tim, if you could look over there.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll just click on that.
Chat. Taisha.
I like Taisha's question. Yes, definitely. Should I read? Can you guys see it?
Yeah, we can.
Have you found that your DH work? Is that the question Taisha has?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, certainly. There's nothing like bringing some money to an institution. It really, and it helps. And so Jennifer knows that. And let me just say why I'm saying that now. I have to take my hat off to Jennifer at the NEH and just the NEH people. From very early on, they have always supported my work, has always been very helpful. Jennifer doesn't know this, but I learned how to write grant applications working through the NEH. I'm still learning, but I've become a much better grant writer by applying through the NEH, getting their feedback, and sort of working through their processes. And so I owe a huge debt of gratitude, not just for supporting the work, but actually helping me to develop my grant writing skills. And so the NEH has been a wonderful, wonderful organization, continues to be, and I look forward to all the wonderful projects that they continue to support and where they're going to go. So thank you, Jennifer, very much.
Of course, that's a ditto from us because they funded the first phase of this project.
Yes.
Grant. So we definitely would have to sign. Totally agree with you on that. So, and hopefully some of the projects that our BPIP scholars are doing will evolve into some projects that can, go for planning grants, development grants, implementation, because we built into our goal with BPIP support for getting to the next stage of a project. So
right.
we are, people are fielding their projects. They're developing them. They're through working with a database, but they're also developing projects on their own. So Taisha is an example of that in terms of doing a DH workshop with students from HBCUs this summer. So lots of exciting things have been happening with them, and we're sort of in the middle, or I guess where are we scholars? We are in sort of on the other side of the halfway mark with your projects. I don't know. You'll have to tell me.
Half.
Yeah. Sarita?
I see a lot of faces that are just looking like.
Yeah, we're getting there. I had a couple of things I needed to finish up. I finished up that library program, and so now I can.
Right, that's right. Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, we're finding, Kim, your model in terms of, you're obviously a professional librarian, but you have a PhD in history. That combination has been very, very helpful. And even though we don't have individuals as much who have both, we have both types of scholars in the BPIP program.
Yeah.
And so people who are librarians and people who are scholars, but then Sarita has taken the next step and has become, done a lot. And of course, that's being encouraged by a lot of institutions as well, providing the opportunity for their faculty to develop another set of skills. So we see how valuable it is. But we hope that combination within BPIP is useful for all of us as working as a collective. Other comments, questions, thoughts? And Sarah, where are we in terms of time? Since I lost so much of my time
trying to get back on
the internet.
We've got about 5 more minutes. We can maybe push it a little bit longer if folks don't have anywhere to go, but we're supposed to wrap up in about 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. Burning thoughts, anybody? And I thought I saw Kirsten earlier, but I don't see her now. She was in for just a bit, maybe, was she?
I think she's here. We just can't see her.
Okay. But I did see a glimpse. I got a glimpse of her. So I didn't know if anybody else wanted to, I know what's going to happen is that we're all going to go back to the recording and listen to this very carefully. I know that's what's going to happen. And have all kinds of questions then that we didn't think of right now because we want to process all that information. But I want to give over time to people who want to share any other thoughts or questions, and we can keep the dialogue going, if not necessarily in the webinar, something we can take up as we go. We have 2 more, right, Sarah? 2 more webinars. So I'm going to shut up, let other people talk.
I see that someone says that if we're interested in NEH funding opportunity, could that person share their contact information with the group?
I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you.
I will say though, and I've made this offer, and it is an offer that I very much stand by and follow through on. I am happy to read anyone's grant application. One of the things that I found in the DH field when I got in it that I did not find necessarily in history or some of the other fields is the generosity of people who shared their grant applications with me. There's something about DH, and I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but there is to me, there has been, my experience has been a very cooperative community of people who are willing to share resources and work with people and things. And so I would be happy to read anyone's grant application and give them feedback if they would like to. Just, email me and I will make time for it.
Thank you. I know everybody is shouting hurrah at that. Just so you know, I said I was going to be quiet, but I wanted to make sure you knew that we have a mixture of people at PWIs, at HBCUs, and in addition to librarians as well as faculty, teaching faculty. So that I think is an unusual mix. And so we're I think enjoying that collaborative process a lot. And I think learning from each other as we try to find a common language, but also share a sense of shared problems and issues, but also some shared solutions that other people want.
That sounds great. And I could tell by the list of people that it was a wonderful, rich mix of people from different institutions with different projects. So it's fantastic.
Okay. So did Jennifer, you share that information? I guess you did.
I put it.
Thank you.
I put it in the chat area.
Thank you. Yes, good. Somebody mentioned, I guess it was Taisha, you mentioned CSHAT, because that was a project funded, of course, and many of us were there. Taisha was there and some other people. So we're seeing lots of, I don't know what the term is, branches and trees.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sure other people are thinking the same thing when she was going through the presentation, branches and trees. Lots of things are happening. And I like that idea because we have a common frame of reference, and we also have a support network that's built in. And so Kim has added to that support network. Jennifer has added to that support network. So this is good. This is all good.
Great.
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Kim. This was excellent. I know we all really enjoyed it, learned so much. And you may be getting lots of emailed questions later.
Or grant applications.
Grant applications.
Everyone, this was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.